Hello and welcome to History Lessons for Roleplayers, Victorian Conspiracy. Now, the Victorian era was from about 1814 to 75 during the life of the Queen. Yet during that time, 1 in 4 people and 1/5 of the land area on the planet was actually controlled and governed out of the British Isles. They were also completely dominant on the seas. Now, this was an era right after U.S. independence and after Britain won the Napoleonic Wars. They had a strong parliament-style government with a constitutional monarchy who was quite limited, and they expanded on their empire. Basically, every time they won a war, they took over the places they fought. This was also the period of the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism was thriving, yet there also was a liberalism, especially at home and among the nobility. People were interested in running the world in not so much an egalitarian way, but at least in an organized way. There was also a number of treaties and intermarriage of the ruling class that eventually would lead to the First World War. But the Victorian era especially was a period of education. There had already been some public education. The Romans certainly had had a great number of grammar schools, but there was an increase of literacy, which was very important. In complex times, people just basically needed to understand, and also with that understanding came a great deal of misunderstanding. There was a proliferation of inventions. As people were able to interact with other inventors, there was an explosion of parts. In the medieval period and Renaissance period, you had to be literally the Renaissance man. You had to understand everything like Da Vinci did in order to be an inventor. But in the Victorian era, not only could you share your ideas with the printing press and the printed word, newspapers, but you could also compartmentalize your inventions. You didn't need to invent everything. You didn't need to make your own metal. You didn't need to make your own metal screws. You could task out a lot of these things and just assemble it yourself. High explosives were invented during the period, and that also led to a renewed interest in mining, especially a deeper mining. And fertilizers were being invented, so crop yield was increasing. Less people were starving, yet also more people were moving into the cities to take advantage of the industrial life and better pay. It was an era where they started to invent different types of warfare, chemical warfare, along with the high explosives. There was improvements in the study of disease, and of course they had harnessed electricity, which was the start of the modern world. In many ways, there was communication, first with telegraph and eventually with the radio. You no longer had to depend upon a written dispatch in order to get your message out. They discovered there was an atom, and they also discovered radiation. But really, those would be inventions they would capitalize on 100 years after, or 50, 75 years after the Victorian era. So let's talk a little bit, first of all, about the discovery of germs. Now, for the longest time, people did not understand disease, and they attributed it to God or devils. Because God was supposedly benevolent, there must be devils. And this goes into the Victorian conspiracy theories that also came about. If there is evil in the world, the evil had to come from someplace. It couldn't just be spontaneously in the souls of men. And this idea that the world had invisible elements, it's not a new idea. The Greeks certainly thought there was an invisible element to all sorts of invisible elements to the world. And they didn't necessarily attribute them to spiritual forces all the time. But the discovery of actual germs was a big thing because it was curing disease, and because it had an impact on the working class and people in general, it was undeniable. And so once you were seeing a world that you couldn't see with your naked eye, you had to start to question what else might be out there that could be influencing your life, everyone's life, or even more importantly, what was out there controlling the government that you don't see. So science also had a predictive element. There was the prediction of the return of Halley's Comet. Once you had the heavens starting to become fully described, and they weren't just angels pushing around objects up there, or they weren't just twinkles of light. It was really a time when the Earth no longer was the center of the universe. It might have been Galileo and Copernicus, even before that, the Greek philosophers who were talking about, well, it's all relative. A Ptolemaic system, it only works because it's a model. But this whole idea that the heavens might be just something of another place to be. They imagine the heavens as being a number of other planets that you can visit, and they attributed the space between planets as maybe being filled with an ether that could be sailed. And certainly if you have a game like Space 1889, the old GDW game, there was an idea that maybe you could just, or Spelljammer, gosh, do we always have to come back to Spelljammer? The Spelljammer, the fact that you could just sail between the planets. And this whole idea was not debunked for a long time. I think the idea of a vacuum even was a 19th century thing. So the Victorians lived with an idea that you could have sort of a chitty chitty bang bang sort of idea, that you could fly wherever you wanted to, or that you could Jules Verne, just fire a bullet and go to the moon. Of course, one of the biggest things that came out during the Victorian era was Darwin's Origin of the Species. Once scientists started describing the fact that there didn't need to be a divine creator, there could be a natural order to things, it both caused a renaissance in spirituality and religion, who is the clockmaker in charge of it all, and also there was a rise in atheism, where man was starting to see that he was the one who could control his destiny. And this plays well again into your role-playing of Victorian conspiracies, because you should have a mix of player characters who are seeing the world as spiritual, God has withdrawn, or God is testing us, and there should be the pure scientists who just cannot understand the supernatural that's being presented to them. When confronted by a ghost or confronted by some madness, they would try to seek worldly explanations when in your roleplay games there would be none. There was also a global mapping that took place during the Victorian era. Now, the maps of the Renaissance and the era of exploration were great, but a lot of the area still had, magical monsters. And in the Victorian era, they pretty much were filling in all the blanks, and there was a desire to be the first to reach certain locations and figure out who and what was actually there. Yet, the more that we learned about the world, the more the utter foreignness of the world started to become something that would cause a conflict. And one of the first conflicts it was causing was the idea, well, if there is one divine plan, why are there so many different people in it? And this, of course, would work well into your Victorian conspiracy, that if there is a divine plan, how is it being thwarted so much? And all those obstacles could be conspiracies, the layer of the onion. Every time you peel back the layer of the onion, you find another threat and another threat and another threat that you need to solve. The Victorian era, now every era had idle-rich, but the Victorian era had its own classification of idle-rich, because they actually, most of them were longing for a simpler time. Now this started with the Renaissance and this idea that there was a noble savage, there was a life, a better life that could be lived by people if we just had a simpler time. Of course, this was the idle-rich, living off their rents from their estates and not working in the sweatshops, who had the time to talk about the fact that there's a better way to live. But maybe one of your characters in your Victorian horror game could be someone who's just absolutely idle-rich and has no idea how the simplest of things work, and that could be a fun thing to play. There was an explosion of philosophies that were being brought back from the rest of the world. It was no longer seen as God and the devil. It was seen as all of these other mysticisms and spiritualism that existed. There was a new cosmology that was being created. If God was not just in the clouds above, where was he? And that idea that there could be dimensions of space, and there could be dimensions of life. There was an inner self and an outer self. All that was leading to, again, and especially in game terms, all the different realms that the players could eventually cross over into. There was a renewed interest, even a rise in mysticism, as the Catholic Church, or the Church of England in this case, was losing authority to the atheists who were proclaiming Darwin. And if there was an atheist element, it was also an element that was also anti-monarchist. And they wanted to make sure that if there was no God and divine order, then why would there be a king? In this case, it'd be Queen Victoria, and she actually faced a number of times when they would argue whether or not the Queen was serving any function to society. And the writings of atheism, atheists, you were no longer being burned for being an atheist. Yet at the same time, when you roleplay this, you probably don't want to cause any internal problems in your group, but you want to make sure that you have the players firmly grounded in reality. They should not step into their roleplay games thinking it's going to be a horror monster. That should be something that's not going to happen. They should think there's got to be another explanation for it. And this is where red herrings and also other diversions need to come in. You need to have this sort of that Scooby-Doo element where eventually the mask can be pulled off and it was Old Man Rogers at the funhouse all along, until the second mask comes off and he turns out that he's a demon or some sort of undead wizard. The Victorian era had its first urban poor and working poor, and they lived in squalor. There was a number of immigrants that was caused by the whole British Empire. There was two classifications. Everyone was a citizen, but there was an English citizen versus a British subject. And that led also to the idea of, even more so than had been in previous eras, of a race and class system. Because it was here in their face every day. You could see the peoples of the British Empire walking the streets, and many of these immigrants had the wherewithal that they're coming into the country and they want to work, they want to get their family and move ahead, they want what they see from the English Society of the Idle Rich, but the English Society of the Idle Rich is starting to see their own wealth shrinking because you really needed to be ahead of the game and starting to be your own venture capitalist in order to keep up with the inflation and with the cost of everything going up. There was a conspiracy that was starting to spread amongst wealth and bankers, that the bankers of the world, they must be the ones that are cheating everyone. Where does this wealth come from? Why is debt so crushing? And the idle rich of England, which were borrowing more and more, and the crowns, to fight these wars, were borrowing more and more. The bankers were starting to squeeze all of society. And there was the central banks at this time were not highly regulated, so there was a lot of speculation. Fortunes were being made and lost very quickly. I know that in an era just before this, there was a big tulip crisis, where the tulip was being imported in Holland, and people were buying the tulips. That they saw, wow, there's money to be made, and then they started to buy not this season's tulips, but next season's tulips, and then they started speculating on the color ranges that the new forms of agronomy and interbreeding of plants was bringing to the market. So there was a huge speculation on the price of tulips, and eventually it all came crashing down, and many people, including Sir Isaac Newton, went bankrupt from it. The globalization of trade was leading to extreme debt and poverty. And this was also causing a rise in trade unions and a rise in farm co-ops. And those two things frightened a society. When you have a ruling class, because even in a parliamentary system, there was a high degree of ruling class. There was an aristocracy that just felt privileged. They're the ones that should make the laws. They're the only ones wise enough to do so. They actually were a number of secret societies, the Freemasons being the most widely known and talked about. The Carbonati were another one. They were basically the Smiths of the Renaissance era, who, hence the carbon being put into the metal. They involved trade secrets, yet with publication and with the revelations that were being brought about by education, a lot of these trade secrets were no longer being seen as magical. They were just being seen as tricks of the trade. And as the tricks of the trades were being lost, a lot of these secret societies were losing a lot of their control over their industries, as immigrants were coming in with the same knowledge that the original artisans and masons had, and they were foreign, and they were not a member of these secret societies. They were, in fact, in many cases, because of racism, they were not even allowed to be in the secret societies. You saw that conflict that was going on in society, and this should come in your roleplay games as well. There should be a general distrust of the working man toward the player characters if they're seen as idle rich, or even between the party there should be sort of a conflict between those who are born to a privileged class and those who had to work their way up. So as the trade secrets are no longer being seen as magic secret, another form of magic sort of filled the vacuum. People, basically primitives all, were struggling to understand their own lives because there was so much new and modern that it was overwhelming to them. Why couldn't we just live the simple life of farmers that we once had, that our grandfathers had? It just wasn't going to be. The rate of change was accelerating. It was accelerating as information became widely known. Information could be faster. It used to take months before a knowledge of a war would happen. But with steam engines and with the telegraph, wars were known within a week. And soon, in the modern era, wars would be known in real time. But colonialism in general in the Victorian era represented a resource. The British Isles themselves would not have enough resources, so they went out to the rest of the world and they got it dirt cheap. Even though slavery had been outlawed, there essentially was a colonization aspect of slavery. You didn't need to bring the slaves back to England. You could basically use them as slave labor wherever they lived. There was also an isolated nature of colonialism. Everything became a second-hand experience. It seemed so much more interesting, the world. Yet many of the idle rich in the Victorian era were still at home reading about things that are happening and yet never experiencing it. Men like Kipling were making their fortune and their fame just by writing regular correspondence from places that he was born in, India, and then he would return as a Englishman as opposed to British subject and be widely lauded in these societies that he could walk in. There was a concept of reincarnation that started to be seen. As Eastern philosophies became widely read, Christian philosophies tended to lose a little bit of their cachet. Reincarnation was certainly a very, very interesting idea to the people of the Victorian era, especially when they combined it with a little bit of a Calvinism or a little bit of a self-privilege that, I'm just waiting to be reincarnated as the next king of England, or I'm waiting to be reincarnated as the next divine savior. There was this challenge, though, to the whole idea of heaven and hell. It wasn't seen as there could be a heaven. How could there be a heaven if all these other people that we're seeing for the first time are finally in as well? That doesn't seem like heaven to me. And the idea of hell as Dante's burning fire. Now that we had fully mapped the world, we sort of wondered, well, where is that hell? Does it fit? How do you get to it? Voodoo and shamanism and druids, all of these sort of ancient, and again, I won't use the word as a pejorative, but I do call them more primitive type of philosophies. They were becoming widely known, and they were being studied academically and also with interest by a ruling class that was hungry for stories. There was an exploration of sexuality, which was unheard of, because women were starting to become more powerful, having more freedoms. There was a challenge to social morals, and Burton, for instance, documented the rights and traditions of women around the world, and he would even rank them quite chauvinistically on how beautiful they are. Asian women started to become idolized from afar, but yet at the same time, the idea that polygamy was widely practiced, or that certain women, not just the ruler Queen Victoria and all she represent, but other women could start running newspapers and having their own social societies and secret societies. Certainly, if you have any women in your roleplay group, the Victorian era would be one of the first eras where a female, a mystical detective would work perfectly fine. In fact, she would have access to certain elements because she would be seen as inconsequential in most of British society. She would come and go, and it would be seen as just quaint rather than as a threat. Where a guy asking questions would be seen as less curiosity and more of trying to find out trade secrets or trying to find out other political secrets. There was the press was starting to popularize the idea of a serial story, told in chapters. Because the press was coming out at first monthly, and then weekly, and then every day, then twice a day, there was a need to fill the pages up with stories. And the stories actually attracted readers. It wasn't the editorials, and it wasn't, there wasn't the cartoon strips coming in as much, political cartoons a few, but you had the idea of these serial stories being told, and that's where some of your best writers were developing their talents. But the stories were also strange. They were new. There was the Arabian Nights was starting to be widely read, and the idea of an explorer that was meeting all these fantastic creatures. Well, nobody could be that imaginative. Some of it must be true. And in your own Victorian-style conspiracy theories, the press should be a great source to start your games. I used to make these mock-ups of one-page newspapers with just the headlines, and the players could go through them and look at the headlines, and from the headlines pick where they want to go to their story. And for me, all the stories would converge back on the same point, because I don't like to waste effort. But for you, if you have more time and you have more of an open style of gaming, that entry-level paper, and it's so easy to make now with modern word processing. Modern, you can hear me. I was doing it with cutting and pasting from actual newspaper articles when I was making some of my first. But you also, with the idea of the strange stories that were being widely told, you had this idea of science, which was half understood and seen as a savior in many ways, especially medical science. But it also was combining with the macabre, in that you would have the Frankenstein story, the vampire stories, all the ghost stories. All these were being published in the newspapers, and they were making people think about that sort of mystical and enchanted world that maybe was being threatened by modern mines and modern railroads and modern high explosives and traveling the sea under steam power. So, I talked a little bit about the egalitarian nature of news, but that cannot be more emphasized. You might have had a town crier or a town notice, but most of the time people before the Victorian era, they were living blissfully ignorant. The majority of people were still farmers from all the way back from ancient time, and they would have a life of toil, and they would have the foundation of their church and family. But as news became more egalitarian, everyone could start to read the news and have an opinion. And when people can get together with opinions, they can influence society. They can riot on the negative side, but they can also just ask why. Pester the people who are the ones who supposedly have the answer. The colonial world also had a number of horrors. It just seems so strange. The people there that were starting to intermingle, the British subjects, they just seem so odd to the egalitarian, even the more liberal Englishmen. So you would have this idea that at home you would have some stability filled with all these political conspiracies, and abroad you would have all the actual real horrors. There were uprisings in the colonies. The British Empire was not a quaint and cozy place. All those people being ruled hated it. There was no happy colonies. You think we were the only ones that rebelled? Eventually Canada and Australia got their independence in a lot of places, but at one time, Britain inherited colonies in Africa, which were uprising, in India all the time, in the Hindu Kush region, in Burma. They tried to make trade deals with China. They had possessions in the Caribbean and in South America. These were all places that did not want a colonial British empire telling them how to live and how to work. There's a story of the Dark Hole of Calcutta, where one of the rebellions, and it was only probably, I don't even think it was 50 people. 50 people from a captured unit, company of men, were put in a prison cell, and it was blown up by the press into this dark hole of Calcutta. Near hell they were put into. And the power of journalism finally was being recognized in this whole jingoism, where yellow journalism, I think is what it was called in the States, where you could promote something and you could even start wars through journalism. And that as well, I think, should be part of your Victorian conspiracy theories, is that the players should either be working to try to prevent the escalation to a war, may call it World War I, or they're trying to help that escalation because they know eventually it's going to also threaten some of the secret societies. And of course, the ones that want the war will be supporting them, the ones that don't want the war won't be, or vice versa. There was this national psyche. People started to associate themselves even more so with the fact that I am an Englishman, I am a British subject, I should be able to go anywhere in the world and nobody should offend me, and I can do whatever I want. Does that sound familiar? There was also national panics at times, as the economy was seesawing, greatly seesawing. You would have periods of huge inflation and runs on banks, and banks would go out of business, and people would lose fortunes, and there was this, sort of hysteria. And that mass hysteria as well, the sighting of monsters for real. You don't need Godzilla to walk through the streets in your Victorian conspiracy game. You can have anyone walk through the streets and cause a fuss, and whether or not it's actually then seen later as just mass hysteria, or if it's seen as what it actually is, monsters in the world. The sun never sets. It's a phrase that was coined to describe the British Empire, that no matter where you were in the world, you could be standing on British soil and the sun would be shining somewhere. There was plenty of war, but as I said, British Navy and the Channel was very secure. Britain itself was not really threatened, even though it didn't win all its wars. Certainly, there's a famous poem by Rudyard Kipling about how the Sudanese were the first to break the British Square, the famous Wellington British Square that won the Napoleonic Wars. Essentially, it's guys with bayonets and muskets facing in four directions, firing out. But the Sudanese, with their two-handed swords, found a way to cleave into the middle of those things. But yet, there still was this superiority felt by the English people. And it manifests itself in racism. Especially, it manifests itself in racism amongst the English lower classes, as immigrants were coming in and taking jobs or prospering. And it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. You look at somebody who's doing well, and you think that should be me. Yet you don't look at all the other people who came in as immigrants that aren't doing well or just struggling as well. But again, it's that impression that somebody else had come in here and had threatened me and threatened my livelihood. Whether or not you add racism into your games or not, Victorian conspiracy games, it needs to be part of the NPC's philosophy. And this, it can be uncomfortable at times. It would be more of an adult type of thing. You don't want to cause children or teens to misunderstand your motivations here. And certainly if you do it with new players, you can really ruffle some feathers if you don't handle it well. You might even want to have that racism happen to a non-human element. Kipling described, the governed people, the British subjects, as poor bedeviled heathens, half devil and half child. You can actually make the subjects of your Victorian dramas, you can actually make them half devil and half child. There was a strong black magic element that should appear in the game. People should use the magic of the world, and especially use the magic of the world against the players. Whether or not the players ever obtain any sort of magical ability, I would tend to err on the side of no, but they always crave it, and anything they would have should be easily countered by some greater element. But you may want to add that non-human element. There could be a communing with the Fae. There could be these sort of superior people that exist within British society where you sense that this might be some sort of immortal. But, it's whether it's, say, an Alan Quatermain that just seems to never lose a fight, or a Dorian Gray who never ages. But there will always be some sort of secret behind that. In case of Dorian Gray, he had a picture of himself taken that would be slowly aging someplace. A little bit like the Horcruxes, I guess. But then again, you also, if you're going to add a racist thought, you're going to have to go to the next step, eugenics. Now, eugenics was starting in the era as well, the Victorian era. There was an idea that there was not necessarily they didn't call it a master race, but they called it a superior man. They even went and tried to prove it. They would take the skulls of different people from around the world and they would fill them with sand. And they would say, the British brain obviously has, an extra half a pound of sand you can put inside the huge cranium of a British man. And of course, the same skulls that they used to test these theories have been actually restudied. And it's a matter of the way you pack the sand. You could put, especially with sand, you can put a lot more sand in a certain skull and make it seem like it's stuffed. Or less sand in some skull and make it seem. It's always manipulative. Start with a supposition that you want to prove, and you're going to do anything you can, cheat or whatever, to make sure that your theory is correct. It's going to be, at least in your own mind, correct. That doesn't make it so. The Victorian era had a number of explorer societies, and these are perfect for play. The players assemble on the docks, you put them on a ship. Gosh, it's a closed-bounded thing at sea. They can't run anywhere. They're hopeless to the sea creatures that can crawl over the deck, or the vampire that's held below. But these explorer societies, they were craving to be the first. They wanted to be the first to find the tallest waterfall, the longest river, the source of the Nile. There was a hunt for treasure within the era. Certainly add that treasure element. At least one character around your player should be totally motivated by his own personal greed. His debts at home, he needs to clear them up. And he's the one that will open the box that everyone else around the table would know, let's not open that box, okay? But it's gold, it's encrusted, we can go to the temple, of the Kali, that old Gunga Din movie. I'm a fan, I like these sort of black and white sort of adventure tales. There was a lure for mapping. It wasn't enough to have generalized maps of the way the world was. They wanted really detailed ones. And of course with photography, they wanted to take photos of all these rare places, all these exotic beasts. The first time they saw prides of lions, and you could bring photos back to show everyone else. The zoos were big as well, but the zoos were, basically just cages that they would put on stage. There was no safari aspect unless you went on safari. And the whole idea that the great white hunter was going to go kill himself an elephant, that's another aspect of your Victorian conspiracy you bring out, is that you can have these the player characters accompanying an NPC who wants to go and kill the only white rhino. Well, what's protecting or worshipping, or what sort of spiritual powers does that white rhino really have? Railroads and canals, wonderful things. They were actually making transport connections. Places that were never connected before were now being connected. But of course, in the case of railroads, especially the one that went through the Sudan, there was just a few lions down there, man-eaters, that stalled that work project for months until the right hunters came down and eliminated that threat. Add a supernatural element to that, a shaman that's shape-changing into a lion, and you have a terrific tale to tell your players and have your players experience. Animal predation was still an incredible threat. If you have a weapon system, even if you have a martini rifle that you could cartridge load, it would still have a finite number of times you're going to shoot that shot before you have a chance to hit or miss. And disease. Malaria, gosh, a lot of the people who were colonialists suffered from malaria, and they would take these daily tonics and mix your tonic with whatever alcohol you desire. So, as it comes to philosophy, people were wondering about, was everything really ordained? In the idea of a medieval church, Renaissance church, everything seemed to be controlled by God and ordained. But in the Victorian era, that premise was starting to be questioned, and people started to go back to an earlier concept of searching for the center. Was the Earth the center of the universe? They were now mapping the stars and realizing that, well, no, it's not even really the center of our solar system. And so this whole idea that, well, there's got to be a center, there's got to be a place we can get to. It was almost that Druid idea that of the center that people were hungering to get back to. And part of that, that idea that there was a center, there was a greater power someplace, brought back the Black Mass. Images of Satan start to appear, and because they were not universally condemned, no one was being burned for summoning spirits anymore, you had a number of people who just were openly starting to worship Satan, which works great in a Victorian conspiracy theory game, because you've got somebody who worships Satan, and that's not enough to put a bullet in him. Cagliostro was a gentleman who died in 1795, and he divined the future. Well, he wrote some tales, and he wrote some predictions, and many of those turned out to be true. When you take as large as the British Empire was, there would be some place that would have a massive disease or a flood or a animal predation. And so there was this idea that, what did Cagliostro know? You can look him up on the internet. There was a search for these ever older secrets. Nostradamus, who died in 1566, and if you actually read some of his prophecies, you realize how easy it is to apply them to anything. But I don't want to be, offend anyone who's a big Nostradamus fan. But there's this idea, and it should appear in your own game, that you can use these ancient wisdom, these secrets that were lost, and try to decipher them. every Victorian conspiracy theory should have some sort of puzzle involved with it. Great puzzles can be found on the internet, or write some of your own. The dark arts were starting to be openly practiced. Now, amongst polite society, where you could be shunned for practicing the dark arts, you would have a secret element. But, people were thinking that if God was not making them prosper like he used to, maybe we need to start worshiping Satan. Ritual summoning. People were trying this. They were, finding the right candle wax, the type of wood that was used in the divining rod, the way the circles were drawn with salt or with chalk or with certain elements. All of that could be things that, in your Victorian conspiracy theory game, could be things that could be found, especially in the colonies, sending forth the players to collect these stuff, to bring it back, to try to conjure, actual demons, to teach the ideas, the dark arts, the lost secrets. Hermes Thrice Great, Hermes Trismegistus, he was really more of an idea that happened in the Renaissance, where there was this idea that there was this god Hermes that never quite disappeared, especially with the tri. Maybe he was one of the elements of the three states of God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. But there was this idea that if something was thought in the past, it must have had some basis in truth. That's totally a fallacy, but it's something that was really in the Victorian era strong. This idea of a golden triangle, a merge of science and discovery. People tried to describe their own mysticism in terms of science. It was really becoming a Frankenstein world where you can merge scientific elements. Can we revive the dead with the new electricity? Can these new high explosives be used to dispel ghosts? Or is it all just going back to the medieval idea of bell, book, and candle? Music was starting to become not just widely popular, but complex. The amount of instruments that were being created, and the pianoforte as it used to be called. People were starting to see music and the mathematical element of music as something that could possibly also unlock a spiritual nature. Again, it's this whole idea of forgotten knowledge. And Victorian conspiracy theories, your Call of Cthulhu is all about your forgotten knowledge. There was actually the writings of this one mad Arab. They called him the Mad Arab. And it was all a hoax. It was all, at least the ones that survive today. But even if there's a hoax, a book that's supposedly written by the Mad Arab that describes the summoning of demons, the power of the Philosopher's Stone to change common elements into gold. Even if you don't have any of that in your own work, or even if they find elements that are just fake, it doesn't mean that the next book won't be real. Ptolemy and Pythagoras, there was all sorts of attributes of lost teachings. There was a big search for the name of God. If we just name God, we can have all his powers. It was an arrogance in the Victorian era that they weren't just the rulers of the world, that they could be God themselves. The term metaphysics appears in the period. And of course, as part of these people who thought they're God, there's going to be a lot of scatological and a lot of collection of bodily fluids, and that can add to the horror elements of the game. When you enter a room and you find out that the guy has been collecting his bodily fluids for several years in jars, it's not only off-putting, but it's definitely a horror start. Should we talk a little bit about the Illuminati? Oh man, you can find the Illuminati theories even today. Illuminati, sort of the keepers of the light. Now, the Illuminati are the ultimate in secret society. They tie into the idea that the world is controlled by a small cabal, and that everything in your own life that goes wrong is caused by somebody else. It has this element where I am not responsible, that somebody is out to get me. Now, if you're actually part of the Illuminati and you come to get me, well, okay. The Illuminati should be a part of every Victorian horror game, and the players should never be members of it. They should only get hints of it, and almost all the times when they peel back a layer of the onion, they find that they destroyed a group that wanted to be the Illuminati, but wasn't actually the actual Illuminati. The Illuminati is also tied to both the rise of Zionism and to a hatred that appears in the period for Jews. And the Jews, as a people, always had their own racism, but There was an idea that there should be an Israel, a new Israel, that was being born in the Victorian era. Carve out a small place. It was originally a vision in Canada, but then the idea caught hold. Well, it should be in the Middle East, where the temple needs to be rebuilt, because you're not going to have a second coming without the temple being rebuilt. But the Illuminati was also tied into this, and you also hear names like the Rothschilds. You had such fabulous riches collected by the end of the 1800s, especially in America, under just a few people, and a few men in Europe as well, that you're naturally going to have people that are going to attribute their rise to power to grand conspiracies. They are the Moriartys of the world. An offshoot of that is also the Rosicrucians, the last of the Catholic sort of collections of Inquisitionists and Holy Crusaders. The Rosicrucians represented sort of a holier element of the Illuminati. The Rosicrucians supposedly were the ones that ended slavery through their backroom deals. They represented a white magic, that magic can be benevolent. It was a blend of Christ versus the demons. The Knights Templar, with all of their collections of treasure and treasure maps and puzzles, they were also attributed as members of this secret society of the Rosicrucians. Illuminati and Rosicrucians, do your internet search. You're going to find great amounts of information you can use in your Victorian games, and even if you do not specifically have NPCs that are related to both organizations, they should be hinted at. And never allow any of your player characters to be active members in either. Alchemy and Transformation. What is alchemy? Alchemy is the idea that it isn't just chemistry, it's metaphysical. You can actually make things transform. And alchemy existed all the way back in the medieval age. It probably existed all the way back to the Roman age. Alchemy should actually be something that should be a greater chemistry, a greater skill that appears in your Victorian roleplay game. Astrology, the idea that the heavens above predict what happens on the earth below. I'm going to leave it at that. Astrology could be used perhaps as a predictive element. You should maybe have a mystic astrologer within the party of players. How well they actually can do their skill should be dependent upon what level they've attained or what rating they obtain. Numerology was being studied, especially with all of the commerce that was going on, all the books and ledgers that were being kept by businesses. Numbers became highly studied. Prime numbers were very important and said to hold power. When the number 3 or the number 11 appeared in places, it was seen to have a very masculine, very dominant power. And if the number 2 appeared, then you would have a different sort of element. Kabbalah, and basically mysticism related to, again, sacred prayers and the naming of God, and divination. Divination is not just predictions, which it is. Whether it's done with a tarot deck or whether it's done with a crystal ball, seeing images. Divination was also used by a number of mining companies to find minerals. They hired mystics to find minerals. And in your games, those hired mystics that the players happen to be escorting should find demons as well. In the era of the Victorian era, you had psychoanalysis was the first developed. Now, people would be talking about their problems. They would just do it in confession with the priest. But now psychoanalysis was having a whole philosophy and a whole science behind what goes wrong and what goes right in the brain. The idea of a soul was starting to lose its power, and the idea that the brain itself could have separate thoughts, and the power of your thoughts could actually control things. There was a whole psychokinesis that was tried. People tried to move things with their minds, bending spoons, and to some of the charlatans that were faking that, they would earn themselves a free dinner that night, or a whole audience of devotees. But yet the power of thought, again, should, in your role-play game, in your Victorian conspiracy theory, there should be mystics and there should be people who can actually use psionics. It almost seems like a must. Yet I don't think it should be as predictive as loading a pistol and firing it. I think it should be maybe something that should ebb and wane. And there's always a merge between the sacred with the profane. People would never be using their magic solely for beneficial purposes, benevolent liberalism. once you start having these powers, they should ultimately corrupt. The era, the Victorian era, had the rise of cults and messianic leaders. One of the most famous is Aleister Crowley. Now, he was a premier person, a medium, who had seances. He supposedly could conjure the dead. So in your Victorian conspiracy games, secrets can be revealed through the conjuring of dead. There's no need to really study the ancient secrets if you can just bring a dead man back to your party and have him tell you what he knows. Of course, if you can actually do this in the game, that would be a threat to all these other secret conspiracies in the game. So as it's done, there would be counter threats, and they would maybe hurl demons and spirits at you, or send you, the wrong dead to converse with. Of course, the psychoactive drugs were certainly widely being used. Edgar Allan Poe was a notorious cocaine fiend, but he was in the New World. Psychoactive drugs are a big part of Aleister Crowley as well. There was this idea that you could take enough psychoactive drugs that you would open your mind up. This is, it's a concept that's hard to debate because it still exists today. If you do enough psychoactive drugs, are you actually expanding your consciousness, making yourself more creative, seeing realms that normally your limited abilities would not be able to see? Most of these psychoactive drugs were coming obviously from colonial world, and they were being smuggled in. And the reverse, heroin, the fragrant harbor of Hong Kong. Heroin was something that was developed by opium, was developed by the British to a large extent, imported by the British, because the Chinese and their empire didn't like outsiders. They were happy the way they were, They built that wall, and it kept out some barbarians for a long time, but that was no longer functioning. But they just wanted to keep away trade and keep away foreign influence. But the British entrepreneurs realized that, hey, if we get enough opium coming into China, they're going to be at our mercy, and this is essentially what happened. Can you see a modern equivalent with people bringing in cocaine and drugs into the United States? Well, maybe that's too much editorializing. But if you want to open trade up to a country that's closed, one of the easiest ways is bring in narcotics. And on that note, let's skip over to another idea that was being developed in the Victorian era. It was the idea of androgyny, that maybe people didn't have sexual sexes, male or female, that maybe there was a blending. And homosexuality was still punished, but it was becoming more socially ignored. And there was also a number of free love artist communes that were formed. It seems odd that the hippie movement of the 60s, 1960s, would actually be a throwback to many of these artist colonies that were in the Victorian era. But there was an element of tantricism, the worship of eroticism that came out of India, that made its way, it might even be Persian, it made its way back to England. And certainly the pleasures of sex, combined with a spiritual philosophy of having lots of sex, that definitely had a number of people that were happy to be participants. Let's talk a little bit about the adventure novel, Lost Cities, Lost Worlds. These were all starting to be written during the period. The Romans did not write of some sort of amazing world with dinosaurs in it, because they didn't know of dinosaurs. They did not write of a man having a submarine who could go all the way down to the bottom of the ocean. These were not stories that appealed to them because their imagination wasn't captured by them. But in the Victorian era, you had lots of adventure stories, and your Victorian conspiracy theory should have this whole adventure element as well. The player should be going into these forgotten temples, into these escarpments, and meeting, the Tarzans and the Alan Quatermains and the lost temples, Indiana Jones. At the same time, the mystery novel was first being developed. Edgar Allan Poe, I think, is attributed as writing the first mystery novel, short story. But the Jack the Ripper captured the imagination. Jack the Ripper, I would have to look it up. I don't know how many people he killed. It's actually a small number, but they were spaced well enough, and it was the sensation of the press of this idea that there's this predator loose in the city, killing prostitutes, killing the weakest among the regular citizens, that would add an element of horror that you want to bring into your Victorian conspiracy. Now, is Jack the Ripper an actual demon? Was he a member of the upper crust being protected? Was it a relative of the Queen? Edgar Allan Poe, of course, was writing his drug-fueled poems and novels, and writing about spirits and people being tortured for crimes. Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing not just about places that existed in the colonial world, but faraway places and even all the way to Mars. H.G. Wells writing about time machines and lost civilizations and lands that time forgot. Jack London, The Call of the Wild, sort of this throwback of what it would be like to look for gold in a frontier situation, and the big master of them all, H.P. Lovecraft. Now, when you read H.P. Lovecraft, the main thing about H.P. Lovecraft is just sort of this internalism. I don't know how well it can be brought out in adventure games. You can, you've probably heard me say, I think the Call of Cthulhu series is a total waste of your time for the mechanics. Maybe the idea of a Victorian, or in this case, maybe a Depression era, even a modern horror game has legitimacy, but I just have not seen it in Call of Cthulhu. But there's fans. And of course, if you've gotten all to this point, nodding your head, and then suddenly I'm bashing Lovecraft, you may be stopping the tape now. I'm not bashing Lovecraft. Lovecraft is a wonderful storyteller. I'm just bashing the mechanics and the application. Most of the time when I've played Lovecraft games, there's nothing to do but just sit back and watch. Your insanity is going to go wrong. Maybe you like that. So let's see if we got a little bit of the horror by geography you can add in your game. Certainly North America, you want to deal with werewolves and shapeshifters. You've got that Native American element of the shamanism. Africa is filled with all those ancient magical civilizations, starting with the Egyptians and going on with the Timbuktu, with Ethiopia and Abyssinia. You have these ancient civilizations that you're going to have more and more interjected in, and those can have both a D&D element of a dungeon crawl through these ancient temples, ancient complexes, and also a horror element with what you're finding there. The lost continents at the poles. It was actually theorized that when the magnetic arcs of the poles were discovered, that they thought that magnetic energy could actually be heating the poles, and maybe that's where Eden was these sort of warmed paradises. So you would have these expanses of frozen area. Suddenly in the middle of it would be this oasis of hot pools and palm trees. The Indian subcontinent and the Hindu Kush warlords, you have this ethnocentric barbarism that would be seen by the more regal of the Englishmen in the area. Far east, you have the secrets of the opium dens, the last dragons, and then, of course, the vast scale of the ocean. Especially as the steamliners appear, there's always going to be some drowned creature or a fish man that's going to crawl out of the water. Port out and starboard home, the posh life would also be a shady one to make sure that the sun stays off of you. The sea creatures especially were starting to be on display in the newly created museums. As I said, zoos were not as popular as just watching dead things in bottles and bringing in the bones of dinosaurs. And of course, if you can see the bones of dinosaurs, where did they go? They must be someplace else in the world. The world's fairs were showing magical technology to the masses. The steam engine and the locomotion, and the first subways were being invented. And of course, not only is the subway a very dark and foreboding place for a Victorian conspiracy area, it's a good place for a slasher. You could tunnel into something that you didn't want to reopen. There were conspiracies at home, magic abroad. You also have the lost and the missing and the possessed from all of the different seances and mediums and spirituality that's being done. Kipling's White Man's Burden. He had his talking animals of the jungle book, the children of the jungle like Tarzan, the canals of Mars, foreboding of some sort of monstrous invasion from the aliens. As angels in myth were decreasing, and they were in the Victorian era, the amount of monsters that were appearing in society was definitely on the rise. I just want to leave you with one last thing that, and I'm reading this from the Black Art's Richard Cavendish. This is an example of an actual spell, and you just see the level of complication and the the detail that's put into it. So you first have to buy a small hand mirror without haggling, and this is a love spell. You take that mirror out of its frame and write the name of the girl you desire 3 times on the back of the glass. Then you have to find 2 dogs which are copulating and hold the mirror in such a way that they are reflected in it. You hide the mirror for 9 days in a place which the girl passes frequently, and afterwards carrying it with you, and she will submit to you. What you have done is to create a magical link between the girl, the sex act, which was captured in the mirror, and yourself, the mirror's owner. Hopefully you'll enjoy a Victorian conspiracy with a better idea of the people that it was set for. More later.